Gameranx presents another episode of Before You Buy, the show where we give you some straight up gameplay and some first impressions of the latest games releasing. My name is Jake Baldino and I've been playing Resident Evil 7 non-stop. Just an FYI real quick, most of this is early in-game stuff. I edited the video to avoid any spoilers. I've been a pretty big fan for the series for all its ups and downs, and there was a lot of hype for Resident Evil 7, but I'll admit that I was actually pretty nervous. But it turns out I totally underestimated how much Resident Evil 7 is a traditional return to form to the original Resident Evil feel and formula. First things first, this game has a hell of an opener. Like, in terms of sound, the atmosphere, and the looks, the game just makes a crazy awesome first impression. It just really makes it feel over the top like this crazy awesome horror movie. And also, this is where it feels the least Resident Evil. This is where it feels almost directly like something like Silent Hill's PT. But I will say it's clear from the very beginning of the game and throughout the game, this game wears its influences on its sleeve. Some really honestly expected ones and some vibes that you didn't really expect or thought belonged in a Resident Evil game. But it does take a lot of these horror tropes and it does manage to handle some of these horror tropes a bit more subtly than something like how The Evil Within did. But it's only a few hours into playing the game, when you get deeper in it, you realize that it is very much a Resident Evil game. You're random everyman guy Ethan Winters searching for his missing wife, and you're stuck exploring a derelict plantation mansion environment, you know, doing the Resident Evil thing, rummaging for healing items and bullets, finding weird keys to open doors, shooting gross monsters, hiding from the Baker family. This new group of antagonists that the game has really banked on to be these iconic villains, and I think they fell a little short, but they are still pretty cool. The nods to classic Resident Evil stuff are both in the forefront with puzzles and item management and just general survival horror stuff. And then there's the more subtle nods, like some references to the series and random reading material, little nods here and there like draining bathtubs and stuff like that, stuff you wouldn't really pick up on unless you were really, really into the series. But I think the experience here is overall very, very good. It's very different, but it's also very familiar. You'll notice I got this far without even mentioning that this time around the game is first person, which completely, you know, is against everything Resident Evil has really been. And I didn't really mention it because you barely even notice it. The game, the controls, the atmosphere, the shooting, the inventory management, it all feels so much like any other Resident Evil game, except for 6, I guess, that it just doesn't really hurt the game at all. Honestly, the first-person perspective is really awesome. I grew to really like it very quickly, and I barely even noticed it. Especially because this is the first Resident Evil game in a while that's actually scary. Is the game really scary? Yeah, at times it can be incredibly effective. I think it was a little overhyped, but there is some good shit here. There's solid jump scares that are actually done well. There's more subtle moments and little things, and there's also like those creepy distant noises. And all that stuff just does a good job even when you're just in like a quiet, comfortable section. And there's just a really good mix of feeling unease just from the lack of items and ammunition and things you need, and the actual graphics and tension and sound design in the game. And I think that's what makes a good survival horror game, because it's hard to design that shit. Weapon, ammo, and health scarcity throughout an entire game, but still managing to feel somewhat fair. Resident Evil 7 nailed it. I've seen a lot of games screw this up really badly, and I'm glad that the series that kind of pioneered it can still do it really well. But speaking of the game actually being scary, let's talk about VR. Now, you can play this game entirely in VR, exclusively on PlayStation VR, which I spent a lot of time with VR, and PlayStation VR isn't the perfect VR headset. It does have its flaws, but it does work for this situation incredibly well. I gotta say, it's really impressive work here what they did, because they essentially built two games in a way. The fact that you can jump in and out of this game playable in VR and not is very impressive. Now, I went gung-ho because I thought I had my VR sea legs playing on my Vive all the time, that I could just blast through this entire game in VR. And honestly, it's really exhausting. It's mentally exhausting. You will feel sick after a while. Not just from the general moment-to-moment gameplay, but just more from fatigue. The way the game is designed in VR gives you multiple ways to actually control and move around the environment. Some are very jarring, some are more smooth and easy to get used to if you don't play a lot of VR. And honestly, if people are playing this in VR, I think the game is going to have a lot of VR newcomers, so it's good that it's really accessible and easy. And I've seen some people say that they get sick just from playing for a little bit, and I didn't experience that. I got some long-term sickness, which may have just been PlayStation VR calibration, but ultimately I spent like between 3 and 4 hours straight in VR mode. And that's where the scares work the best. When the stuff gets right up in your freaking face, it's really impressive. It's not all good. I do have my complaints, but I do want to gush about the environment design here. I love the look, of course, because it's very different. It's in Louisiana. It's a very different style, but it still manages to feel Resident Evil with the weird moonlight streaming through the trees, the boarded shutters, the wind blowing, the ravens cawing in the background. It all just works, and it's all detailed, and it just makes you want to explore these environments from top to bottom. Actual combat itself is very fight or flight based. You do have enough ammunition to sometimes work your way through encounters, and aiming is actually surprisingly good considering you're being pitched as the everyman guy who has no combat experience. After a while, it gets pretty easy to pull off headshots and stuff. It's just more the enemies are very tricky and the way they move. But between the anxiety-inducing combat and inventory management, it just feels really, really good. And it just makes for some honestly compelling gameplay, not to mention the bosses here. They're not really perfect, but the way a lot of them revolve around the Baker family is cool. It's different. It's Resident Evil trying something new here, and while it doesn't always completely knock it out of the park, you gotta give them credit for it. There are some really scary moments with these characters, and then there's also some surprisingly just straight up Resident Evil shit with the boss battles too that I'm not gonna spoil. My biggest cons with the game are, first and foremost, combat is actually emphasized a bit too much at points. I just found towards the end of the game combat encounters being way higher than anything in Resident Evil and in this type of game, the way this game is designed should really have, you know? My other criticism is that the puzzles in the game aren't really even puzzles. Most of it is really just searching for things and finding things and figuring out where to put them, but it's all pretty telegraphed and very easy. It's really just key-based. There's not a lot of actual cryptic puzzles. I think I can count on one hand the amount of times I actually had to use my brain and critical thinking. As a game that is so much of a return to form on Resident Evil, I expected more of a challenge on that front because the rest of the game is really, really damn challenging, and that's why I loved it so much. I was hooked on how freaking hard this game was. Every encounter, every boss, every moment-to-moment enemy in a hallway, everything was challenging and nerve-wracking and anger-inducing, but I loved it. It's just a good old-fashioned, challenging, regular video game, and I like it for that. Now, in terms of the actual Resident Evil universe, I myself was somebody who had pictures of Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine on their locker as a kid, and this is what I was worried about the most with the game, because honestly, the lore did get a little out of control, but I still really like it. Without spoiling anything, there is an explosive ending in the game where you realize how things are connected to the main series, but it's mostly unsatisfying. I personally think they should have just completely rebooted with this and not left it connected to the rest of the Resident Evil games. And I say that as someone who loves all the weirder sides of Resident Evil lore. But thankfully, on the flip side, I do think the end does raise some interesting questions that I would like to see answered. I do chalk that up as a win for them, at least. So if your question with the game here is replay value, I'd say it has the same replay value as something like Resident Evil 1, 2, 3, or 4. There's multiple difficulty modes, you get new things to go back and play the game with after you finish it, and I finished the game in just over 10 hours. But length is, again, like any other game in the series. It kind of depends on how aggressively you play. That sounds short, and it is short, because everybody plays differently, and some people could take even less time. And I know some people out there that here's 10 hours, and they're not even going to touch the game. But the way this type of game is, it's a Resident Evil game. And that's not a good justification for the short length, but there is a lot of the replayability here, and I will say, and I don't always use this argument, but this time around it is definitely quality over quantity. But overall, I do think this is a very good game. I wouldn't say it's like the best Resident Evil game, but I think as a game, it has some legs to stand on, and I'm really looking forward to what could possibly be a Resident Evil 8. It's scary, it's challenging, it evokes classic Resident Evil gameplay, and I was generally just very satisfied and hooked from beginning to end. But you probably know by now how my before you buys work. I give you guys some pros, some cons, and some personal opinion thrown in there. But now I want to hear yours down in the comments because I know everybody has an opinion about this game because there are so many Resident Evil fans out there. I want to know what you guys are thinking with this. If you did cruise through and finish it like I did, were you satisfied? Did you have fun? And how do you feel about the ending? Let's talk about that stuff down in the comments. I'll be there answering any questions you guys have about the game, and I'll also be on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Jake Baldino as well. You guys know the deal. Clicking the like button helps us out a ton, and we appreciate it. But if you're new, clicking that circle button and subscribing is a good idea because we put out videos like this every single day. But as always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you guys next time.